In a small, quiet town in Texas, there lived a troubled 15-year-old boy named Dylan Hayes. To anyone who passed by the modest house where he grew up, everything appeared normal. The home was a typical middle-class residence with a well-kept lawn and a white picket fence, but behind the facade of suburban life, Dylan's world was anything but normal. He carried the weight of addiction on his young shoulders, a struggle that began long before he even reached his teenage years. Dylan had always been a curious and energetic child. His parents, Sarah and Michael Hayes, were dedicated and loving, determined to provide him with everything he needed to succeed. They tried to raise him in an environment filled with love, encouragement, and support. But despite their best efforts, there was an invisible force that crept into their home, slowly and silently changing the course of their family's future. Addiction had made its way into Dylan's life at an early age, and it was a battle that he could not escape from. It started small, with a few pills here and there that he found in the cabinet at home. At first, it was easy to dismiss as a passing phase, a brief curiosity, but as time passed, the grip of addiction grew tighter, and Dylan found himself becoming more and more dependent on substances. By the time Dylan turned 15, his addiction had escalated dramatically. He had become heavily involved in drugs, especially prescription painkillers. What started as an innocent exploration of something that seemed harmless soon transformed into a dangerous obsession. It wasn't just a phase anymore. The pills were no longer a curiosity. They had become an escape. Dylan's once bright, eager eyes now appeared hollow, a reflection of the darkness that had taken root inside him. He began skipping school more frequently, and his grades, once average but manageable, plummeted. His parents noticed the change immediately. Where he had once been social and outgoing, he now became distant and withdrawn. He retreated into himself, locking away the person he had been. His bedroom, once a place of warmth and comfort, now became a refuge from everything, a space where he could shut out the world and indulge in his addiction. Sarah and Michael had tried everything they could think of to help Dylan. They had sent him to counseling, hoping that talking through his problems would help him find a way out. They enrolled him in various programs designed to treat addiction, but each attempt seemed to fall flat. No matter what they did, Dylan continued to spiral. The more they tried to control his habits, the further away he seemed to drift. His parents were left feeling helpless, watching as their son became more volatile, more erratic, and increasingly difficult to reach. They didn't understand what was happening to him, and it seemed that no matter how much they tried, they couldn't pull him out of the hole he had dug for himself. The emotional distance between Dylan and his parents grew with each passing day. What had once been a close-knit family was now a fractured unit, each member dealing with their own fear, confusion, and sorrow in isolation. Sarah and Michael would lie awake at night, wondering what had gone wrong. They had done everything right, hadn't they? They had provided a stable home. They had supported Dylan in everything he did. So why was this happening? Why was their son, the child they had loved and nurtured, slipping further away from them? The once optimistic parents were now weary, drained of hope, and exhausted by the constant battle. At first, Sarah had tried to reason with Dylan. She would sit him down and ask him to open up, to tell her what was wrong, to let her in. But every time, Dylan would pull away. His anger, frustration, and shame overwhelmed him, and he couldn't bear to face his own reality, let alone share it with his parents. His anger manifested in unpredictable bursts, throwing tantrums over the smallest things, but the deeper resentment lay in the silence he increasingly offered them. He was a shadow of the boy he had once been. Where once there was hope for a bright future, now there was only a deep sense of dread. Michael, too, had tried his best, but as the years passed, he became more resigned to the idea that he couldn't control the situation. He began to throw himself into his work, trying to ignore the gnawing guilt and helplessness that consumed him. As much as he loved his son, Michael felt that there was nothing left to be done. Dylan's downward spiral was something neither he nor Sarah could stop. No matter how hard they tried, his addiction was like an impenetrable wall, and the more they tried to scale it, the further it seemed to stretch. In the dark hours of the night, Michael would sometimes ask himself if there was any hope left, if their family would ever be the same again. Dylan's behavior worsened over time. He was no longer the boy who had once shared laughter with his parents or shown an interest in their family's future. Now he was unpredictable, a volatile mix of anger, shame, and drug-fueled haze. His interactions with his parents had become increasingly hostile. There were fights over missing money, accusations of lying, and moments where Dylan, fueled by the chemicals coursing through his veins, would lash out. Each blow to the family's unity felt deeper, and the sense of loss grew more pronounced. They had once dreamed of Dylan becoming the young man they had hoped for, someone with ambition, someone who could break free from his struggles. But as the days turned into months, the realization set in. They had no control over the situation, and Dylan was only sinking deeper into his addiction. Despite their efforts, it became increasingly clear that Dylan was spiraling out of control. He was no longer the bright, curious boy they had raised. He had become a stranger, a person his parents didn't recognize. His addiction had consumed him entirely, and no matter what Sarah and Michael did, it seemed they were losing the fight. The spiral continued to accelerate. His behavior became more erratic. He started to lie more frequently, steal from the family to feed his habit, and his mood swings were impossible to predict. The once hopeful outlook they had for his future was now replaced with an overwhelming sense of dread. By the time Dylan turned 15, his addiction had not only taken over his life, but also the lives of his parents. Sarah and Michael, unable to control the situation, were left in a constant state of anxiety. The weight of their failure to save their son was something they couldn't escape from, something that haunted them in their quiet moments. Despite everything they had tried, Dylan's addiction had only deepened, and their relationship with him continued to deteriorate. The boy they had loved and hoped for was slipping away, and they were powerless to stop it. The love they had given him, the support they had provided, seemed to have no effect. Dylan's descent into addiction had become the defining story of their family's existence, and as the days went on, they were left to watch, helpless as the person they once knew disappeared before their eyes. The evening air in the Hayes household was thick with tension. It had been building for days, weeks even, as the cracks in the family's once solid foundation grew wider. Dylan, only 15 years old, had been retreating further into the depths of his addiction. His parents, Sarah and Michael, had watched helplessly as their son spiraled into a world they couldn't understand. A world that was far darker and more dangerous than anything they had ever imagined. No matter what they did, no matter how many counseling sessions or interventions they tried, Dylan seemed beyond their reach. He had always been a curious and energetic child, full of potential, but now he was just a shadow of the boy they once knew. The vibrant spark that had once shone in his eyes had been replaced by the hollow, glazed look of someone trapped in the grip of a powerful addiction. Every day was a battle for him, and each day he grew weaker, more desperate. His need for drugs consumed him, clouding his thoughts and drowning out everything else. He was no longer just a teenager experimenting with substances. He was a young addict, fully entrenched in a world where every penny, every moment of peace was dedicated to feeding the unrelenting beast inside him. Dylan's addiction had taken hold of him in ways that his parents couldn't begin to comprehend. The once promising young boy, who had played sports and had dreams of a future, was now a person consumed by his cravings. Prescription painkillers had become his drug of choice, and over time, his dependency had deepened. He no longer cared about school, about friends, or even about his family. His thoughts revolved around one thing: his next high. And as his addiction grew, so did his desperation. One evening, as the tensions within the household reached a boiling point, Dylan's desperation reached new heights. Sarah and Michael had just finished yet another exhausting round of arguments with their son. The same tired conversations where they tried to talk sense into him, and he deflected with anger or silence. Every word they spoke seemed to hit a wall, and every attempt to reach him made him pull further away. The emotional exhaustion from trying to help him, coupled with the constant stress of dealing with his addiction, had drained them both. Sarah had spent hours that afternoon trying to find new ways to help Dylan, while Michael had retreated into himself, giving up on hope. They didn't know where to turn anymore. The family had become a place of constant conflict, uncertainty, and fear. Dylan had become a stranger in their own home, a person they no longer recognized. That night, as Dylan sat alone in his room, the familiar sense of panic crept in. He had run out of money, and his cravings were becoming unbearable. The withdrawal symptoms were starting to kick in, and the gnawing ache in his stomach, the restless feeling in his limbs, were all too familiar. Dylan knew that he needed to get money, and fast, if he was going to feed his addiction. His mind raced with ideas, and his desperation began to cloud his judgment. For months, Dylan had watched his parents struggle to make ends meet. They had worked hard to provide for their family, but the money never seemed to be enough. Michael had kept a small stash of savings hidden in a drawer, tucked away for emergencies or for moments when they needed a little extra. Dylan knew about it. He had always been curious about the money, and over time he had become increasingly aware of its existence. He had seen his father take out a few bills here and there, but he had never thought much of it at the time. But tonight, the temptation was too strong, and the need to get high was far more urgent than any moral reservations he had. Dylan slipped quietly from his room, his mind racing with the thought of what he was about to do. The house was quiet, with only the distant hum of the refrigerator breaking the stillness. He crept down the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done this before, sneaked around behind his parents' backs, taken small amounts of money, hidden his tracks. He had stolen before, little things that didn't seem to matter. But tonight, this was different. This time, it was the family savings. He had reached a new low, and he knew it. But in his desperate mind, the only thing that mattered was getting the money he needed for his next fix. He reached Michael's office, the small room at the back of the house where his father kept a few personal things. The drawer was there, just like always, and Dylan knew exactly where the money was hidden. His fingers fumbled with the drawer handle for a moment, the weight of what he was doing sinking in, but the need for the drugs was greater. He opened the drawer and quickly slid the bills into his pocket. It wasn't much, just a few $100s, but it was enough. Enough to get him through the night, enough to quiet the craving, enough to keep him from facing the terrifying consequences of his addiction for just a little while longer. As he stood there, with the money now in his possession, a small voice in his head tried to make sense of what he was doing. This wasn't the Dylan he used to be, the one who had dreams, who had a future. But that Dylan felt so far away now, buried beneath layers of addiction and despair. He closed the drawer quietly and quickly made his way back to his room, his heart still racing. He couldn't stop now. He had what he needed. His mind was already thinking about the next step, about finding his dealer, about getting the relief he so desperately craved. Dylan believed he could get away with it. He had taken money from his parents before, but this time felt different. He told himself that no one would notice, that it would be a small crime, a desperate act born out of necessity. But what he didn't realize was that his actions would set off a chain of events that would unravel everything in his life. The next morning, Sarah and Michael discovered the missing money. Sarah was the first to notice. She had always been the one who kept track of their finances, and the absence of the cash was immediately apparent. She searched the house, retracing the steps they had taken, but there was no sign of it. Her heart sank when she confronted Michael, and together they realized what had happened. Their son Dylan had taken the money. He had stolen from them, and in that moment everything they had tried to protect him from seemed to come crashing down. The discovery sent shockwaves through the family. The same son they had tried so hard to help had betrayed them in the worst way. Michael and Sarah were heartbroken, but the anger they felt was palpable. They couldn't believe what Dylan had done. He had already been struggling, but now this was something they couldn't overlook. The guilt they had been carrying for not being able to help him seemed even heavier now, as if the theft was the final straw that shattered their fragile hope. Their son, the boy they had tried to raise with love and care, had chosen his addiction over their trust, over their sacrifice. The tension in the house escalated after the discovery, and the distance between Dylan and his parents grew even wider. Their trust was broken, and the damage was irreparable. What had started as a small, desperate act to feed his addiction had now become a pivotal moment in a story that would end in tragedy. The decisions Dylan made that night, the choice to steal from his parents, would ultimately set him on a path that he could not turn back from. The morning after Dylan had taken the money, Sarah Hayes walked through the house, her mind consumed with an unsettling feeling. It was a typical morning at first, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the quiet stillness of a suburban home, but Sarah felt something was off. As she went about her usual routine, tidying up the house, preparing breakfast, her eyes kept drifting to the small drawer in the living room, where Michael kept their savings. The drawer had been left ajar the night before, and the absence of the money hit her immediately. She opened it again, hoping she was mistaken, hoping that she had just misremembered where the cash had been placed. But there was no money. The small stash that Michael had carefully hidden for emergencies was gone. Panic gripped her chest. Sarah searched the house methodically, retracing her steps from the day before, but the money was nowhere to be found. She felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. This wasn't just a misplaced wallet or a few dollars missing from her purse. This was different. She knew that the missing money was more than just a simple error. It was a betrayal, a sign of something much deeper. Dylan had always been known for his lies and his reckless behavior, but she had hoped, deep down, that he would turn things around. After everything they had been through, after all the counseling, the tears, the desperate attempts to get him help, Sarah had hoped that Dylan was finally beginning to understand the weight of his actions. But now, in the quiet of the morning, it was clear to her that everything had changed. The money was gone, and the only person who could have taken it was Dylan. When Michael came home from work that afternoon, Sarah couldn't hold the mounting anxiety any longer. She confronted him, her voice strained with panic, explaining what had happened. The words tumbled out of her mouth faster than she could control them. Michael, initially confused, listened carefully as Sarah detailed her discovery. She was frantic, her hands shaking as she clutched the edges of the counter. The thought that Dylan, their son, whom they had tried so hard to help, could betray them in such a way was almost too much to bear. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the deep sense of disappointment and hurt that settled in Sarah's chest. Michael stood silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He wasn't shocked by the theft itself. He had known for some time that Dylan was slipping further away from them. But he had always believed that his son still cared, that there was still some part of Dylan who would remember the love they had given him. But this, the theft of their savings, felt like the final nail in the coffin. It was a line that Dylan had crossed that Michael never imagined he would. After a tense conversation with both of them trying to piece together the puzzle, Michael and Sarah reached the grim conclusion that their son had indeed taken the money. The realization hit them both like a wave. Dylan, the boy they had raised with so much love, the child they had tried so hard to protect, had stolen from them. Their hearts sank, and the room felt colder. Michael's mind raced, the betrayal settling deep within him. He had spent so many sleepless nights worrying about Dylan, trying to be the father he needed, but now the child he had once cherished was not the same person anymore. In a moment of desperate need, Dylan had chosen the drug over his family, over the love they had offered him. The emotional toll of that hit Michael hard, and a mix of sorrow and betrayal filled him. His son, the boy he had nurtured, was now a stranger to him, someone who had taken from them, someone who had crossed a line that couldn't be erased. Sarah's anger, meanwhile, was immediate. It wasn't just a sense of betrayal. It was a searing frustration that Dylan, after everything they had done for him, would steal from them in such a callous manner. She had tried so hard to shield him from the world, to offer him the protection and guidance he needed, but it felt like all her efforts had been in vain. The money was a symbol of everything they had worked so hard for, and Dylan had taken it without any remorse or concern for the damage he had caused. For Sarah, it wasn't just about the theft. It was about the deeper loss. Dylan had become someone they didn't recognize, and it was as though the foundation of their family had crumbled beneath them. The tension between Dylan and his parents reached a breaking point that night. The house, once filled with the sounds of family dinners and laughter, was now silent, save for the quiet hum of the air conditioning. The space between them, emotionally and physically, had never been more vast. Sarah and Michael's world had been torn apart by Dylan's addiction, and this This final betrayal had shattered what was left of it. Their once quiet home, where they had nurtured and loved their son, had transformed into a battleground. There were no more quiet evenings, no more hopeful plans for the future. The tension had reached a fever pitch, and there seemed to be no way out. What had once been a close-knit family now felt like a distant memory. Every interaction with Dylan felt like a confrontation. Every word exchanged seemed to carry the weight of unspoken anger and frustration. Dylan had pulled away from them long ago, but now it was as if he was actively pushing them out of his life. His addiction had created an insurmountable wall between them. The boy who had once been part of a family that loved him unconditionally was now a stranger, someone whose needs and desires were driven by his addiction, not by the love or concern of his parents. Michael and Sarah had both struggled with Dylan's addiction for months, but this theft felt different. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the feeling that everything they had done, every effort to help him, had been wasted. The money, though significant, was merely the catalyst for a much deeper realization. Their son was no longer the person they had raised. The boy they had hoped would grow into a man of promise and responsibility was slipping further and further away from them, and they were powerless to stop it. They began to feel helpless, cornered by the actions of their own son. The weight of their inability to protect him, to save him from the destructive force of addiction, was overwhelming. It wasn't just the theft that had devastated them. It was the crushing sense of loss. Their once hopeful vision of Dylan's future had been replaced by a terrifying reality. The boy they had dreamed of watching grow up, of sending off to college, of seeing him find a career and a family of his own, seemed impossibly far away. In his place was a young man who had become consumed by his addiction, someone who had lost his way, and the road back seemed more impossible with each passing day. The pain of this realization was palpable, and as the evening stretched on, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier. Michael and Sarah sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, unsure of what to do next. They had tried everything: counseling, interventions, support groups, but nothing had worked. Now, the theft of their savings felt like a final, unforgivable blow. They were faced with the harsh truth. Dylan was no longer the son they had raised. He was a person they no longer recognized, a stranger caught in the grip of addiction. And they were left with the heartbreaking knowledge that their family, their hopes for the future, had been irrevocably altered. As the evening wore on, the tension in the Hayes household grew unbearable. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was replaced by the growing tension in the air, an uncomfortable silence that hung over the entire house. Sarah and Michael were consumed by the discovery of the missing money, their minds racing with a mix of disbelief, betrayal, and anger. They had always tried to provide their son with everything they could, but now, in this moment, it felt as if their efforts had been in vain. Dylan, the child they had raised with love and care, had stolen from them, and the reality of that theft hit them harder than anything else. Dylan, meanwhile, was growing more and more agitated as the evening went on. He knew that his parents had discovered the theft. He could feel their eyes on him, the judgment in their gazes, the weight of their disappointment and anger pressing down on him. It was suffocating. His stomach churned with guilt and shame. But these emotions were overshadowed by something much stronger: his addiction. The craving for the next high gnawed at him constantly, and in the midst of all this turmoil, it was all that mattered. His parents' anger and disappointment felt like a distant echo compared to the overwhelming need for the drugs that controlled his every thought and action. The house, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt like a battleground. The very walls seemed to close in around them. Dylan could sense his parents' fury, their faces flushed with anger, but instead of retreating, he only grew more defensive. He wasn't ready to face their accusations, to face the truth that he had betrayed them. So, in the only way he knew how, he lashed out. His words were sharp, each one filled with frustration. He shouted back at them, trying to justify his actions, but the explanations he offered were nothing more than a tangled mess of excuses. He claimed they didn't understand his struggles, that they couldn't possibly know what it was like to feel the constant need for the drugs that had taken over his life. His voice, filled with emotion, echoed through the house as he continued to defend himself. His parents' concern, their worry, their desperate attempts to help him all seemed like a distant memory in that moment. Dylan was consumed by his own anger, by the sense of being misunderstood, by the overwhelming need to escape. The addiction that had slowly but surely taken control of his life was now at the forefront of his mind, and nothing else seemed to matter. Sarah, standing across from him, could barely recognize the boy she had raised. The Dylan she knew was no longer there. The boy who had once been bright, hopeful, and full of potential had been replaced by someone who was angry, irrational, and consumed by his need for the next high. She wanted to reach out, to say something that would snap him out of it, but the words caught in her throat. She could see the pain in his eyes, the confusion, but she also saw the rage. He was no longer the son she had known. He had become someone else, someone who seemed beyond her reach. Michael, on the other hand, stood in silence for a moment, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and helplessness. His thoughts were racing. He had spent years trying to help Dylan, trying to steer him away from the path he was on, but every attempt had been met with resistance. Every time they tried to get him help, it felt like he was slipping further and further away. Michael's frustration had been building for months, but tonight, the discovery of the theft had brought everything to a head. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the years of trying and failing, the broken promises, the unfulfilled potential. It was about the love he still had for his son, but also the anger he felt toward him for pushing them away. As the argument continued to escalate, Michael's emotions boiled over. He could feel his own frustration reaching a breaking point. The years of watching his son spiral into addiction, of helplessly trying to stop him from destroying himself, had left him drained. He had tried everything he could think of, counseling, therapy, even tough love, but nothing had worked. Dylan had only gotten worse, and now, with the theft, it felt as if they had finally reached a point of no return. Michael's anger surged, a mix of sorrow, guilt, and frustration overwhelming him all at once. In a moment of blind rage, he reached for a nearby object. It was almost as if his body acted on its own, the years of pent-up frustration finally breaking free. The object in his hand, a heavy lamp, was used instinctively, without thought, without any real understanding of the consequences. In his fury, Michael struck Dylan. The blow came fast, a single hit that landed with a sickening thud. Dylan collapsed to the ground, his body crumpling beneath the force. The room fell silent, the air thick with shock and disbelief. The immediate aftermath was nothing short of surreal. Sarah screamed, her voice a mix of horror and confusion, but it was too late. Dylan was already lying on the floor, motionless, his body limp. The shock hit both parents like a tidal wave. For a brief moment, they stood there in silence, staring at their son, unable to process what had just happened. The violence had been so sudden, so unexpected that neither of them could fully comprehend the magnitude of what they had just done. Michael, who had always prided himself on being the protector of his family, was now standing over the lifeless body of his son, his mind struggling to catch up with the reality of the situation. The weight of his actions sank in slowly, like a heavy fog descending over him. He had lost control, and in doing so, had taken everything from his family. Sarah, too, was paralyzed by the shock. She had screamed, but the sound felt distant, as though it belonged to someone else. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The sight of her son lying on the floor, unmoving, shattered her completely. Everything she had tried to do, everything she had hoped for, had led to this moment, a moment she couldn't undo. The guilt, the realization of what they had done consumed her. The minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity as they both stood there, trapped in the horror of the situation. The reality of the violence they had just experienced was too much to absorb. They had crossed a line that could never be erased. Dylan, the son they had once known and loved, was gone, taken from them in an instant by their own hands. There was no going back. The family they had been was now destroyed, and no amount of regret or sorrow could change that. What had started as an argument over a stolen sum of money had escalated into a devastating tragedy. The love they had once shared was now tainted by the irrevocable violence that had been unleashed. What Dylan had taken was not just money, it was the final straw in a family already on the edge. And now, in the aftermath of that violent act, all that was left was the weight of their actions and the deep, unfillable void left in their lives. The once promising future they had envisioned for their son was now gone, and in its place was a tragedy they would never escape. The realization of what they had just done hit Michael and Sarah like a ton of bricks, crashing down on them with an unbearable weight. The moments immediately following the violent act seemed to stretch into an eternity, and the silence in the house was deafening. It felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving only the sound of their frantic breaths as they stood frozen in place, staring down at Dylan's motionless body. His once vibrant face, filled with the fire of youth and rebellion, was now pale, the life drained from him in an instant. The harsh reality of what had just transpired was too much for their minds to process. They couldn't comprehend the enormity of the situation. How had they gone from anger and frustration to this? What had started as a heated argument between parents and their troubled son had spiraled out of control into an irreversible tragedy. The violence had not been premeditated. It had not been planned or thought out. Michael had never intended to hurt Dylan in such a brutal way, but in that moment, overwhelmed by years of helplessness and frustration, the anger had overtaken him. His emotions, which had been building steadily over time, had exploded in a way that he never thought possible. Michael had always prided himself on being the protector of his family, yet in this moment he had failed in the most unimaginable way. He had struck his son, and in doing so had taken the life of the very person he had tried so hard to protect. As the gravity of what he had done sank in, Michael dropped to his knees, his body trembling uncontrollably. His hands shook as he reached out to Dylan, desperately hoping for some sign, some miracle that would bring his son back to him. But there was nothing. There was no breath, no pulse, no response. The cold, still body beneath his hands was a stark reminder of the irreversible nature of his actions. Dylan was gone. Michael's mind screamed in disbelief, but the reality was undeniable. The weight of his son's lifeless body, the emptiness in the room, crushed him under its intensity. He couldn't move, couldn't think clearly, as the enormity of the situation overwhelmed him. His own child was dead, and it was his own rage that had led to this. Sarah, standing a few feet away, was in shock. Her body was frozen, her mind unable to process the horror before her. The woman who had spent years raising Dylan, loving him unconditionally, and doing everything she could to protect him, now stood paralyzed by grief. She couldn't tear her eyes away from his body, couldn't fathom that the son she had nurtured, the boy she had loved and protected, was no longer with her. The child who had once laughed, played, and shared his dreams with her was gone in a flash of violent emotion. Her heart pounded in her chest as the reality of what had happened slowly sank in. She had seen the anger in Michael's eyes, the frustration that had built up over months of watching their son spiral out of control, but never had she imagined that things would escalate to this point. The guilt washed over her in waves. Had they failed him? Had their attempts to help him, to save him, not been enough? Questions flooded Sarah's mind, each one more painful than the last. What had they done? How had they allowed their anger to take over, to destroy everything they had worked so hard to protect? Their love for Dylan had always been unconditional, but now, in the blink of an eye, that love had been marred by a moment of uncontrollable rage. She could feel the weight of the consequences pressing down on her, suffocating her. There was no going back. They couldn't undo what had been done. The guilt of taking their own son's life, the life they had tried to save so many times, would haunt them forever. Sarah collapsed beside Michael, her legs giving out as the full force of the tragedy struck her. The grief was overwhelming, a tidal wave of sorrow that threatened to drown her. Her sobs were silent at first, just a quiver in her chest, but soon they erupted, uncontrollable and raw. The pain of knowing what they had done was too much to bear. She had always feared losing Dylan, but never like this. She had never imagined that it would be their own hands that would take him from her. The very thought of it tore her apart. She had tried so hard, fought so hard to help him, to save him from the clutches of addiction, but now all of her efforts felt futile. They had tried to protect him, but they had failed. For both Sarah and Michael, the room felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in around them, and everything in the house that had once felt like home now felt foreign and hollow. The weight of what they had just done left them immobilized. They had killed their own child. They had tried to protect him from the world, from himself, but it had all been in vain. They had failed him in the most final and devastating way possible. There was no coming back from this, no way to undo the horror they had unleashed. The silence in the house felt suffocating. Nothing could be said. Nothing could explain away the tragedy that had just occurred. The enormity of their actions hung over them, pressing down like a heavy stone. Michael, still kneeling by Dylan's side, didn't know what to do. His mind was numb, and his body ached with the weight of regret. There were no answers, no solutions. There was nothing he could do to bring his son back, nothing he could say to ease the crushing weight of their guilt. Sarah sat beside him, her head in her hands, her body shaking with the weight of grief and horror. She had spent so many years hoping that Dylan would overcome his addiction, that he would turn his life around. But in this single, devastating moment, all of her hopes for him had been destroyed. They had tried so hard to help him, to fix him, to save him. And now, all that was left was the knowledge that they had failed. Dylan, the son they had poured all their love and energy into, was gone. The reality of what they had just done was a nightmare that neither of them could escape from. Their son, the child they had brought into this world, had been taken from them in a moment of blind rage. And now, in the aftermath, all they had were the shattered pieces of their once happy family, broken beyond repair. The grief, the guilt, the shock, it all felt like too much to bear. They had lost their son, and they had done it with their own hands. The police arrived shortly after, alerted by concerned neighbors who had heard the commotion and the sounds of screaming. Michael and Sarah were arrested without resistance, their lives shattered by the tragedy they had caused. They were charged with the murder of their 15-year-old son, a crime that would forever change their lives and the lives of everyone who had known them. The legal proceedings that followed were a blur of courtroom drama, media attention, and public outrage. How could parents, people who were supposed to protect their child, commit such an unthinkable act? Throughout the trial, the prosecution painted a picture of two parents who had been pushed to the edge by their son's addiction, but who had ultimately crossed a line that could never be undone. The defense, while sympathetic to the emotional turmoil that Michael and Sarah had experienced, could not deny the evidence. Their son was dead, and they were responsible for his death. In the end, the jury convicted them both of manslaughter, sentencing them to years in prison. The tragedy of Dylan's life, his struggles with addiction, and the violent death that followed would serve as a stark reminder of the profound consequences of unchecked anger, fear, and resentment. This heartbreaking story became a tragic reflection of the powerlessness that addiction can have on families and the devastating effects it can have when emotions overwhelm reason. Dylan's life had been full of potential, but in the end, it was cut short by a combination of circumstances beyond anyone's control. His death was a senseless tragedy that shattered his family and serves as a reminder of the importance of addressing addiction, mental health struggles, and anger before it's too late.